She joined MAC CEI in 2018, and she has extensive cultural resources management experience, including participating in pedestrian surveys, test excavations, and large-scale data recovery excavations across southwestern United States. She has completed field investigations in Texas, Oklahoma, Ohio, New Mexico, and Arizona. In addition to serving on the HAS board, Ashley and her public archaeology program in Northwest Houston. When she's not in the field, Ashley also serves as a commissioner on the City of Houston's Archaeological and Historical Commission and is the Director of Student Relations for the Houston chapter of WTS, an international organization for transportation industry professionals. Ashley received her master's degree in anthropology from the University of Texas in San Antonio and a bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Texas.
Thank you, Linda. What my biography should tell you is that the longest I've spent at home is during the pandemic. Okay, let's see. All right, there we go. So everybody should be able to see my slide now, right? Can you see it, Linda?
No, I need to stop sharing my screen. Hold on just a minute.
Okay.
And I can see your slides, Ashley.
Okay, great. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. It's great to talk to everybody on Zoom tonight. It's been an adjustment to get used to presenting in this format, but I think it's great to be able to connect with everybody. There'll be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please think of questions and ask them. You know, this is a topic that I'm interested in, of course, as a CRM professional, and just feel free to ask. So tonight I'm going to talk about cultural resource management. I'm going to give an overview as to what cultural resource management is, what people who are in the cultural resource management field do, what are cultural resources, what are some of the laws that regulate cultural resources, and how do these inform archaeological projects? How do these inform the decisions that professional archaeologists make? Then we'll look at a hypothetical project, and then we'll look at a project that we're currently doing. We're going to look at Club Woods and how some state laws, or really one important state law, interacts with that project. So cultural resource, I'm going to move this real fast, it's in my way. Okay, so cultural resource management really arose from the idea that American heritage is something that needs to be managed. So cultural resource management is the practice of identifying and preserving cultural heritage. And of course, there's laws and regulations that guide this management. There are several subfields that fall under cultural resource management. This includes anthropology, architectural history, preservation planning, and of course, archaeology. CRM archaeologists you may have heard called contract archaeologists or consulting archaeologists or even shovel bums. But in reality, the name doesn't matter. We're all doing the same thing. We're all focused on the nation's or the state's cultural history. We're going to do research to identify, evaluate, document a given resource. We're going to identify or advise that particular project on how to address the cultural resource that's in their project area. And in some cases, we're going to facilitate stewardship of that resource. While CRM archaeologists may specialize in a certain field like geoarchaeology or prehistoric archaeology or a certain geographic area or maybe even a certain analytical skill set, we're also generalists. We're always looking to understand the history or prehistory of the project area that we're given. So to understand CRM, it's important to understand its legacy. And its legacy is rooted in the westward expansion in the United States. There is this desire to document everything that is vanishing. What are the nation's natural and cultural legacy, and how do we document these things before they vanish? So in 1848, the Smithsonian Institution narrows in on these mounds that are identified along the Mississippi River. And they want to link the mound builders to potentially Native American groups in the area. So this interest in mounds really spurs archaeological investigation throughout the Western United States, especially Cahokia. So in the left-hand screen, that's Monk's Mound at Cahokia in East St. Louis. And it really sparks people's imaginations and want to conduct expeditions and explore. So we see private funds and funds through institutions spread out. So for instance, down in the middle photo, we have Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, and it was first explored in 1896 through funding from the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Hyde Exploring Expedition. And like elsewhere during this time period, these artifacts are crated up and shipped back to institutions in the East for further study and documentation. The next big change in understanding American cultural resources happens in 1906 when the Antiquities Act is passed. There was this great loss in data at Civil War battlefields during this time, and this was spurred to protect sites that were perceived as having natural importance. And this is during the same time that President Teddy Roosevelt is starting the national park system. So there's this great emphasis on natural and cultural resources that are important to the nation. And this law does some pretty important things. It protects archaeological materials on lands owned by the United States. So it's creating our first national preservation policy. It gives the president power to set aside historic landmarks. So now we can have national monuments. And it gives federal agencies the ability to properly care for the materials that they're excavating. So they're going to create curation facilities, and they're going to create museums to display them in. During the 1940s, we see yet another reincarnation in how the US is approaching its cultural history. New Deal programs and the Work Progress Administration is creating federally sponsored and funded archaeology. The goal of the Work Progress Administration, archaeology, was to get people working, not necessarily on preservation or data analysis or on reporting. WPA labor and funding really assisted in the rehabilitation of some of Texas's historic architecture right in time for the Texas Centennial, and this of course includes the Alamo. The Alamo Plaza was restored in between 1934 and 1938. And what you see with some of the WPA restoration work is that there wasn't necessarily an emphasis on historic accuracy as much as there was on aesthetics. After World War II, we see yet another era of building towards cultural resource management. There's these two acts that are passed: the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act and the 1960 Reservoir Salvage Act. So this allowed salvage archaeology to happen during the planning phases and construction phases of highway and dam or reservoir projects in the US. And this of course leads to the river basin surveys. And we'll touch on that on the next slide as well. So how do we arrive at more modern cultural resource management in the United States? That really happens with the passing of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. This requires all federal agencies to review the effects that their actions or undertakings will have on a cultural resource that is eligible for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. So just remember that word, eligible. The passing of this legislation really renewed interest in archaeology, especially public interest in archaeology, in cultural heritage, and in the environment. So the next law that comes out during this time period of new interest in cultural resources and environment is, of course, the National Environmental Protection Act in 1969. And these two acts really lead to the development of cultural resource management of professional archaeologists operating business of archaeology. So how do all of those things then affect us as a state? How do we, as a state, progress through time like we're doing at a national level? Well, we see in 1907, one of the first more professional archaeological investigations going on at Wolf Creek in the panhandle of Texas. This of course, captures the attention of the Smithsonian Institution and the Bureau of American Ethnology, and they come visit the site in 1914 and 1915. But they think that they have more culturally rich sites elsewhere, and so they don't stay for long. The next phase we see is J.E. Pierce of UT Austin, starting excavations outside of Austin. He then starts to contact educators throughout the state and ask them what their important archaeological sites are, and starts to bring this data back to UT Austin, creating this massive collection of data from archaeological sites across the state. So this focus on archaeology, of course, leads to New Deal programs and WPA, where we're investing in some of our cultural resources and cultural legacy in the state. So we discussed, of course, the Alamo. Another example is Presidio de San Saba, which I encourage you all to go visit. It's a really interesting site, and you'll see some of the decisions that were made on restoring the site and making it a resource in Texas. We then flash forward to the river basin surveys here in Texas, the Texas Archaeological Salvage Projects. They identified important archaeological sites at reservoirs across the state. They conducted important investigations of rock shelters along the Pecos River. And of course, during this time, all of these collections are funneling back towards institutions in Texas like UT Austin. So by the 1960s, UT Austin has this incredible collection that's in several different departments across the institution, and it's all consolidated, and we see the start of TARL in the 1960s. Okay, archaeology versus archaeology. So some of you may have noted that archaeologists spell the word differently. The story goes that in 1880 or 1881, the government printing office did not want to include the AE, the diphthong, in their printing process, so they decided to simplify the word and drop the A and just stick with E. And this created a uniquely American spelling of archaeology. You will hear some people debate that the spelling of E is not only uniquely American, but situates it in a new theoretical understanding of archaeology in North America. It's an interesting debate, but neither spelling is incorrect. The archaeology with just one E is usually used by the federal government and really does represent that American spelling of the word. All right, so what are cultural resources anyway? What are the things that are requiring management? So these are usually the things that are leaving behind evidence of human activities in the past. And these resources can have strong ties to the communities in which they're situated or stakeholders who might be located in other areas. So there's kind of a rule of thumb that we look at in thinking about what are the cultural resources that need to be identified. One is it a structure that is 50 years old or older, right? Is it a historic archaeological site or feature? Is it a prehistoric archaeological site or feature? How about cemeteries? You know, cemeteries can be very important to the communities they're in. In some cases, artifacts can be important cultural resources. Think about the things that are the rarest to find, or sites that may only contain a very few artifacts from that time period because it's so rare to have that preservation. Documents. The Declaration of Independence is a very important document in terms of our American identity. It would be terrible if that was lost. Landscapes. There can be cultural affiliations to landscapes, important features in the landscape. So these are the things that we start to look at when we're looking at a project and thinking through what are the cultural resources on that property. So preservation laws. What are preservation laws designed to do? Well, they have different applications between public and private land, but these laws and regulations give us procedures and assessments. They outline the responsibilities of each party involved in the process. They guide the creation of appropriate documentation. like our technical reports that we write at the end of a project. They dictate the criteria that will be used to determine if a cultural resource is eligible for inclusion on the National Register or as a state antiquities landmark. So some of the questions we ask when we're thinking about what preservation law may be triggered by a project that we're looking at, we're wondering, is this land owned by the state? Is it owned by a federal entity? Is it going to require a permit through a federal agency or a state agency? Or am I receiving funding from a federal agency or a state agency? These help situate us into what regulations we're going to be following and what recommendations we're going to be following. Okay, so let's talk about the two main laws that guide us in Texas. There's other cultural resource laws out there that guide cultural resource practice, but these are the two that we typically encounter. So let's look at the federal law first. So the federal law is the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. It's administered through the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. If you hear archaeologists talking, sometimes we're referring to Section 106. And all of us, this is leading to eligibility on the National Register of Historic Places. So if you look at this building and the orange circles that just appeared, that's the National Register plaque. You often see these on buildings denoting that they are eligible and are indeed listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Before I leave this slide, you know, Section 106 is the requirement within the NHPA that has federal agencies address potential impacts of their undertakings, right? Of their project, their construction, whatever is going to be happening to that property, on historic properties, on cultural resources, on archaeological sites, right? And it also defines who are the participants in this process, what are their roles, and the goal, right? The goal of the archaeological investigation is to determine if that archaeological site or historic property is eligible for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. So does it meet any of the criteria for listing? So what are those criteria? So we have two sets. So we have 7 aspects of integrity, which are in the green half circle. And so these are used to determine if the historic structure meets certain criteria to be eligible, right? So we're looking at location. Where is the place where it was built? Is it still standing where it was? Is it still deposited where it was originally deposited? Design. Is it containing the elements that reflect the original conception of our feature or our house, right? Is it reflecting that function and aesthetic of that time period? It could even be relationships between two features on the landscape. You know, are they still having that context of their overall, how they relate to each other on the landscape? Setting is the overall environment in which the historic structure or archaeological site is situated. Materials, the physical objects that were constructed or deposited that retain the materials of the time period. So do they have a hallmark of that particular time, that particular aesthetic? Workmanship is the physical evidence of the craftsmanship from a particular cultural or social group. Feeling. Does it retain the expression of a particular aesthetic? So think a Victorian house. Does it still have all of those elements of a Victorian house or a rock panel? Association is a direct link between the historic event and the property. Does it still have those physical features that associate the cultural resource to the historical event that happened? So once those integrity criteria are reviewed, then we move on to eligibility criteria. And this is how the property will be determined eligible and nominated for listing on the National Register. And so we have 4 criteria. Criteria A and B are similar in how they look at the eligibility of a property. You know, they're looking for a significant historic association and that it's retaining its physical features. Criteria C is looking more at architecture and architectural styles. And then criteria D is looking at archaeological sites pretty more explicitly. And it's really focused in on, does the archaeological site have the potential to yield more data that could address important research questions that are important at a state level or really a national level to contribute to our understanding of America's past. All right, let's look at state. So state law, we're guided by the Antiquities Code of Texas. The Antiquities Code of Texas passed in 1969 to address the loss of Texas cultural resources. It was actually started to address the loss of shipwrecks along the Texas coast. There's a lot of data being lost from these. So one of the important things it did is it established the Texas Historical Commission. It created the role of the State Historic Preservation Officer, which is an important role in the Section 106 process. And it really refers to projects that are being undertaken by political subdivisions of the state. So what are political subdivisions of the state? These are school districts, cities, counties, county engineering departments, et cetera, et cetera. So we also have our own recognition for resources that are important to the state. This is a state antiquities landmark, and these are sites that are protected by the Antiquities Code. But one thing to note is that if you're looking at an above ground resource, a building, they have to be included on the National Register of Historic Places. So this building is unique in that it has the Texas medallion with the National Register of Historic Places. Okay, other designations, of course, can be recorded Texas landmarks and Texas historical cemeteries. All right, so what are the different steps to a typical CRM archaeology project? So usually we like to get a call when a project is in a planning phase. So when a route, a footprint, or a potential property has been identified. So step 1, we usually conduct an archaeological background study where we're reviewing the available data, right? We go and we look at historic aerials and maps to see what has been there in the past. We look at environmental data like soils and vegetation. We look at historic impacts. Has this property been subject to rice agriculture? Was it a sand pit mine? What are the different things that have potentially happened on this property that could affect the preservation of a cultural resource that's on it? We then write a report. It's a technical report, and we send it out for review by whatever agency may be consulted on the project. So say we find that there's a potential for cultural resources on the property. We then move into phase 1 field investigations. You may hear this called pedestrian survey. These are where we're digging little shovel tests, or we're digging backhoe trenches to start to assess cultural resources in the field. If we identify cultural resources, like you see in this first figure, we would then delineate the site. And I'll go a little bit more into delineation in another slide. The top right photo is one of my favorite photos. On that one, we got to take a 4-wheeler out in the field, and it was a pretty cool phase 1 investigation. Okay, so if we found a significant site during our phase 1 and we wanted to learn more about it and start to assess its eligibility potential, we may move on to phase 2 investigations, which could be eligibility testing or site testing. These are where we start to excavate test units instead of those little small shovel tests. And we start to really assess the integrity of the site, start to think about those eligibility criteria and if the site has enough integrity to be eligible for listing. Okay, if a site cannot be avoided, if it's going to be impacted by the project, then the investigations may move into phase 3, data recovery. Data recoveries are usually sensitive in nature, so I don't have a lot of data recovery photos that I can share, but these are large-scale excavations. They're really there to try to understand as much of the site before it's gone. Other things happen during this, like engaging stakeholders, education. There's a lot of different ways to do a site mitigation. But for this instance, our phase 3 is data recovery and doing large-scale excavations. HAS has been involved in some phase 3 excavations. Okay, so let's do a hypothetical CRM project. So we get a call and we pick up the phone and our client goes, we need an archaeological investigation ASAP. And we go, okay. So we need to start pulling some data for the project to start thinking about what we are going to look at and how we need to plan out this project. So first it starts by asking some questions to get at what laws we might be operating on, right? Is this going to be a project that is utilizing the Antiquities Code of Texas? Is this one that's going to be looking at Section 106? Or is it going to be a combination of the two? So we start asking about who's funding this project? What sort of permitting is involved in this project? Who owns the land? Will it be impacting a river or a nearby stream? Or is any grant money going to be involved? And so once I start to narrow in on that, then I know what laws I need to meet and what standards I'm going to use to meet those laws. So this is our hypothetical project area. We usually call these areas of potential effects. As archaeologists, we're usually looking at what are the direct impacts to the project area and what are the direct impacts within that APE, right? Area of potential effects. What is going to be built there? What is the size of it? Okay, so I'm going to start with my desktop review. I'm going to look at this APE. I'm going to look at the soils and maybe consult with a geoarchaeologist about soil formation. I'm going to look at historical data, aerials, topographic maps, maybe newspaper accounts, anything else that maybe can tell me about potential cultural resources there. I'm going to look at the databases available through the Texas Historical Commission. So say I find that there's a potential to encounter cultural resources here, maybe no previous archaeological survey has been done, maybe there's an interesting feature out there that I can see that says that there's going to be cultural resources. So then we move into phase 1 archaeological investigations. And so we're going to do a pedestrian survey. So here's my project area, pretty rocky. See a lot of rocks on the surface. I see some interesting materials on the surface. And then there we go. I actually have some debitage and lithic tools. So once we find these materials, we delineate. And in Texas, typically you start at your positive shovel test, and you do 2 shovel tests in each of the cardinal directions, and you start working off of that on a grid. And the purpose of this is to find out the extent of your archaeological site, look at the depth of it, try to see if you can see some vertical integrity. You know, are the oldest materials at the bottom? Are the youngest materials at the top? Do you see any stratigraphy there? Is there anything that can indicate that this is an attack site? Does it need to move on to phase 2? Do we need to start thinking about eligibility testing? So, you know, we're really looking at what is its research potential? What could it potentially tell us about Texas prehistory? And based on the data that we gathered in the field and gathered during our background investigations, what does this mean for further studies, further field investigations? And then we write a technical report and we submit it to reviewing agencies so they can read our recommendations and our reporting and see if they concur with our interpretations and findings. Okay, so that's one set of projects. You know, this is something that HAS is very familiar with. We've done a lot of work with other agencies. You know, think about the works that has been done with at Diamond Knoll or Frosttown. What are some of the other big ones that have been done? You know, all of these sites were undertakings by maybe different agencies or different project sponsors. These are cultural resource management firms that are doing the work, and HAS is seen as an important stakeholder. You know, HAS is very interested in the cultural resources in Houston and the surrounding region. And some projects have the leeway to bring stakeholders in and have them involved in certain aspects of the project. So let's talk about a different project. So Club Woods. So Club Woods falls under the Antiquities Code of Texas because it is land that's owned by the county. So we do have an archaeological permit for it, and I'm serving as principal investigator. But this is a unique project in that we're using the property and the cultural resources there for educational outreach. So not just for HAS members to go learn about archaeological practice and ethics, but also to reach out to the community of Northwest Harris County with this fantastic resource that is in the community, but the potential to teach about archaeology, history, and prehistory in the county. So of course, this is actually pulled from our scope of work that we wrote to pull the permit. And you can see the 1944 aerial photo of Club Woods, and then the 2017 aerial of Club Woods. And of course, it is covered with trees now, whereas in the other image, it's not as much. But if you see the rectangular fields, let's see if you can see my map. Rectangular fields right here. Here's the club farmstead. And so that little box right there is the main house, and then you can see all of these little barns and this interesting feature down here. So we've really been focusing our work thus far here. And then one group, when we did our pedestrian survey portion, where we took photos of the different features we identified that are still above surface at Club Woods, they walked all the way down to this little farm or little pond that's down here that is now in very thick brush. So what are some of the unique things we've done at Club Woods? Of course, we've done ground penetrating radar studies. We've done a lot of public outreach with students. We've done HAS only excavations out in the yard. We have found some rock that's pretty unique to Houston geologically. All of these studies are being done under this permit. You know, this is all archaeological investigations happening on county land. This is great public outreach. It's great for reaching out to future community stakeholders, creating interest in the cultural resources of Harris County, and educating the public. You know, that's a very important thing that we do as archaeologists, is take the cultural resources that we're finding and make sure we have stakeholders, make sure we engage the community, and make sure we educate people on what is available where they live. So I wanted to show this slide as well. So when we were doing a scope of work for this project for our antiquities permit, we did write in that we'd be doing ground penetrating radar, and we selected a few areas where it could potentially be done. So this map is the 2017 aerial, greatly zoomed in, and the yellow boxes are all of the different structures that I had identified on the 1944 aerial. And then areas 1, 2, and 3 are the 3 areas that we conducted GPR on. So here we go. Here's Sarah Chesney running the GPR machine with a few people out, and this is area 1. And then this is what area 1 looked like on the GPR screen when we got the data. I can't process the data on this computer right now. It would just slow it down and crash it. But what's interesting is this, of course, is our units that we opened up at Digging Old Stuff. And you can see, if you remember, we've had the metal and the wood stringing all the way down until we hit this rock feature. And this came from approximately that location, right? In this blue area that was waterlogged at the time, and we didn't expect to find much. So I'm hoping that when coronavirus is gone, knock on wood, and we can get out in the field again, that we can continue to investigate this area of clubwoods for these different outbuildings, continue to engage with the stakeholders in the community up in Northwest Harris County, and continue to learn about this German farmstead. I have a bibliography for the reading that I can send out if anybody would be interested. So thank you all for having me talk today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. The chat function can be accessed using Control or Alt-H, or if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a little chat bubble that will open up, and you can ask a question and the moderator will ask them.
That's my cue. Hi, Ashley. Yep. Okay. Well, no questions yet, but we did have one comment, and that was from Bob Sewell on the E versus the diphthong, and he says, darned, well, I'm editing, darned good idea. The fewer vowels in a word, the better. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. The printers agreed. I don't know. Sometimes they say that some folks feel that the AE is snooty.
Okay, we've got a question.
Okay.
This is from Kathleen Kelly, and her question is, can you tell us more about the use of aerial views? Is 1944 the earliest, and how extensive are they?
So no, 1944 isn't the earliest. You can get some pretty good images from the 1930s. So Google Earth, sometimes in certain areas, you can get back to the 30s. Most areas go back to about 1995. Aerials packages can start at $100 to purchase. And there's some online providers. There's also a resource, oh gosh, I think it's called historictopos.net or something, where you can go back and look, and I think they have aerials from the 30s that you can look at, but they're all going to be printed with historicaerials.net all over them.
All right.
The same with topographic maps. If you're interested in looking at historic topos, USGS has a website called TopoView, and in some cases it has topographic maps going all the way back to the 1880s.
Okay, well, you've got another question. This one's from Julia Speed and Andrea Russell.
Okay.
How often does NEPA come up in CRM work, and can you give us some examples?
Okay, can you say that one more time, Liz?
Sure. How often does NEPA come up in CRM work, and can you give us some examples?
Okay, so it frequently comes up, actually, because usually we're dealing with projects that are seeking some sort of environmental permitting. You know, sometimes we'll see permits through the Army Corps of Engineers, in which case we're operating under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. The National Environmental Policy Act actually uses the National Historic Preservation Act as one of its cultural resources. And, you know, NEPA is looking at the human environment, and of course cultural resources are part of that human environment. In reality, when we're doing our cultural resource projects, we're really trying to meet that threshold of Section 106. You know, that we really want to do a strong technical project that is meeting those requirements. You know, the state of Texas does have standards for archaeological practice for field investigations, site delineations, backhoe trenching, approaches to technical reports. So we really do have a lot of guidance in how we do good ethical archaeology in the state of Texas.
Well, you did get another comment also from Bob. He says, tell Ashley that was a great talk. I think we all agree that was a very good talk. We'll give it a few more seconds if anyone else has any questions. But
I mean, I threw a ton of information at you guys, but I hope what it narrowed in on is when archaeologists are approaching a project, what we're thinking about when we're trying to structure what we're doing in the field. So when you're out participating at like a Cullen Mobile or in Memorial Park or even a screening project, this has been planned out and is trying to meet these regulatory requirements. So we're always asking ourselves certain questions when we're planning the project and we're out in the field to make sure that we're hitting those notes that we need to hit to produce a comprehensive study. And you know, that's not always possible. Sometimes things happen, but we're always striving to meet that threshold.
there is another question.
Okay.
Once we are able to get back out there, ideally, how often will we be back at Kleb Woods?
That's a good question.
That's from Aaron. Thank you, Aaron. No pressure or anything.
No pressure. Aaron, do you want to go out?
Just getting stir crazy.
Oh, I don't know if you just heard that from the background, but Ian is sitting behind me and he just said he wants to go.
Oh, well, that's a good sign. He's getting stir crazy.
Yeah, that's a good sign.
Okay, we've got another question, and that is from Val. What kind of time frame does ASAP really mean, and who pays for the archaeological investigation?
Usually ASAP is going like, we needed this 30 days ago. So usually it's whoever is doing the undertaking is paying for it. So, you know, we try to be mindful when we're creating budgets about who the client is and what their funding is going to be. But yeah, we like to strongly encourage everybody to do their environmental studies, including archaeology, in the planning phases, because we never want to be in the moment where, oops, we found something and now the project has to completely stop, right? We always want to be doing the archaeology well in advance. So if a significant site is found, right, that has integrity, that's eligible for listing on the National Register, it could potentially be avoided and preserved. So we don't have to do data recovery and mitigate it.
All right, Kathleen Kelly has another question.
Okay.
COVID-19 has sidelined everything, but it would appear that much of your field work probably seems safe in that regard. Can you comment or have thoughts on that?
So yes, a lot of our field work is considered essential, right? Because we're supporting transportation and energy and all of these other essential projects. So what we're doing is we're practicing social distancing in the field, where instead of digging as a team of two, we're digging individually. We're wearing face masks. We're passing out copious amounts of hand sanitizer to everybody in the field. We're wiping down our trucks and equipment to make sure that we're not infecting our coworkers if we're sick. We're monitoring everybody in the field and their health. You know, we're very focused on keeping our field crews safe and healthy. And that's part of the reason why I like my photo that was in Linda's slide. It's very representative of how we're looking now with our hard hat, safety vests, and face masks.
Okay, Marcel has a question. When did the USGS start taking photos countrywide?
That's a good question. I don't know that one. I know you
I bet
find
Lewis knows.
probably. I know you can find earlier than 33, but I don't know that those are necessarily USGS.
Any other questions? Well, that was a great talk, Ashley. Thank you. Thanks from the
Yes,
Houston
thanks so much.
Archaeological Society. We enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll have this up on our brand spanking new YouTube channel very soon for anyone who wants to go back and study it again.
And feel free, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, send me an email. I'd be happy to chat with you.
So we actually do have a question, and that is, what is your email?
Okay.
So that we can get those resources.
There we go. It's ajones@macenv.com. That's macenv.com. I can't wait till that's out on YouTube.
Yeah, well, I'll have Julian make a slide for it.
Okay.
All right, great meeting. I guess we'll sign it off here then. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for coming. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.